The wind howled across the barren ridge, carrying a bitter chill that cut through the thin uniform of the lone cadet. He shivered, tugging the collar of his jacket closer. Coffee stains darkened the front of his shirt, a humiliating mark he'd earned this morning when a nervous hand spilled the last sip onto his lap. His name was Ethan Cole, and everyone in the military camp, he was a joke. A rookie, a klutz, a cadet too green to last a single day on the front lines. Yet here he stood, assigned to guard a shallow ditch on the edge of a contested zone. It was the most miserable post in the sector, exposed, lonely, and entirely pointless. Most veterans called it the graveyard of ambition. Ethan looked down into the trench, its muddy bottom streaked with yesterday's rain, and wondered why anyone would voluntarily fight here. "Cadet Cole!" barked a voice from behind, sharp and impatient. Ethan snapped to attention. Sergeant Lawson, a grizzled veteran with scars etched across his face, marched toward him. His boots clomped heavily against the frozen ground. "You're in charge of this ditch," the sergeant said, almost with disdain. "Enemy scouts will probably ignore it. Don't get yourself killed doing nothing. Stay awake. Watch. That's it. Understand?" "Yes, Sergeant," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Lawson shook his head, muttering under his breath as he turned away. Coffee-stained and clueless. Let's see how long this one lasts. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the camp, even if no one was actually watching him. He wasn't just fighting the enemy out there. He was fighting the judgment of every seasoned soldier who thought he didn't belong. The ridge was quiet. Too quiet. In the distance, the dark horizon hinted at movement, shadows slipping like ghosts across the pale moonlight. Ethan squinted, trying to catch the faint glint of metal that could be enemy scouts. "Just scouts," he muttered to himself. "They're not looking for trouble, not yet." Minutes stretched into hours. Ethan trudged through the monotony, checking the trench line, shoving dirt and stones back into place, adjusting his position. He tried to focus on simple things: the sound of the wind, the crunch of frost under his boots, the rhythm of his own breathing. Then he noticed it, a faint shimmer along the ridge, almost invisible, moving faster than any human should. His heart thumped in his chest. He crouched lower, eyes narrowing. They're here. The enemy wasn't a ragtag scouting party. They were efficient, precise, and trained for ambush. He could tell by the way they moved, the way the moonlight glinted off their armor. And yet, they had no idea he was waiting. Ethan grinned, a flash of determination cutting through his fear. "Let's see what you've got," he whispered. He remembered his training. Not the fancy drills that impress instructors, but the survival strategies, the overlooked tactics taught in late-night lectures. Every ditch had its secrets. Every ridge had blind spots. And he had a mind sharp enough to exploit them. He shifted a small rock into the path, adjusted a branch to cast a shadow, and crouched behind a mound of mud, invisible to the approaching enemy. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to hide, but his pride, his desire to prove himself, anchored him in place. Then came the first sign of life, a low murmur, the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Ethan's pulse raced. He could see the silhouettes now, crawling like spiders over the ridge. There were more than he expected, much more. His small ditch, this forgotten outpost, was about to become the stage for something no one could have predicted. Minutes passed. The enemy was close now, almost upon him. Ethan took a deep breath and steadied his hands. He had no reinforcements, no backup, just him, a coffee-stained uniform, and the stubborn certainty that humans weren't meant to be underestimated. And then a voice broke the silence. "Easy target, just a cadet. Nothing to worry about." Ethan smiled under his breath. That's exactly what I was counting on. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. Every shadow, every movement amplified into possibility. The enemy thought this was an easy assignment. A weak, isolated cadet guarding a ditch they could overrun in minutes. They were wrong. Because Ethan Cole had learned something no one else on the battlefield seemed to understand. It wasn't size, strength, or experience that won battles. It was awareness. It was cunning. And sometimes it was sheer, unrelenting audacity. As the first enemy scout stepped into his line of sight, Ethan's fingers tightened around his rifle. The coffee stain on his shirt the ridicule from his sergeant, the long hours of training. It all faded away. For a single, sharp moment, he was more than a cadet. He was a storm waiting to break. And when the enemy finally realized the mistake they had made, it would already be too late. The ridge lay under a pale, cold moon, each shadow stretching like fingers of the night itself. Ethan Cole shifted in the shallow ditch, muscles stiff from hours of waiting. Every sound, the crack of frost underfoot, the whisper of wind through bare branches, seemed louder than it should have been. He wasn't supposed to matter. Just a coffee-stained cadet, left alone to guard a ditch that no one would remember if it fell. That was the plan, wasn't it? Let the rookies take the meaningless posts. Let the experienced soldiers focus on the real battles. But Ethan didn't care what anyone thought. If this ditch became a grave, he'd make it a grave no enemy would forget. He checked the lines again, tracing the shallow trench with his eyes. Small divots, little slopes, nothing remarkable to the casual observer. But he knew every inch, every rock, every twig, every shadow held potential. He crouched lower, brushing a hand over the cold mud. This ditch was more than a post. It was a weapon, if used correctly. And then he heard it. The faintest crunch of boots over frozen earth. Ethan froze, straining his ears. Too many to be a lone scout, too careful to be careless. The enemy was coming in force, but they hadn't spotted him yet. Good. They didn't know what waited in this ditch. They didn't know him. He adjusted a small pile of mud, hiding a shallow depression. A branch angled just so cast a misleading shadow. Tiny details, enough to trick eyes and minds trained to read terrain. To them, it was an empty ditch. To him, it was a trap. The first figures emerged from the ridge line. Soldiers, well-trained, armed, confident. Their laughter carried faintly over the wind. Just a cadet, one said. What can he do? Ethan's lips curled into a faint, almost invisible smile. Exactly. He waited. Not a twitch, not a sigh. Just patience. His rifle rested lightly against his shoulder, fingers poised. Every instinct told him to strike at the perfect moment, to hit when they least expected it. The enemy moved closer, unaware of the shallow traps Ethan had prepared. One slipped slightly on a hidden patch of ice, catching himself with a grunt. Another's foot hit a small pit Ethan had dug in the mud hours ago, almost tipping him forward. They didn't realize they were being funneled, guided, herded into the exact spot Ethan wanted. Minutes stretched. The cold bit harder now, but Ethan ignored it. Adrenaline surged through him, sharpening senses and focus. He wasn't a rookie here. He was a predator waiting in plain sight. Then the first scout crossed the center of the ditch. The moonlight glinted off his armor, and Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. But he didn't fire yet. No, this was more than a simple shot. This was a lesson. A demonstration of why humans weren't to be underestimated. The scout paused, peering into the ditch. His companions laughed softly behind him, joking about a stupid cadet guarding a ditch. They moved closer. Ethan exhaled slowly, heart pounding his ears. The moment was perfect. And then he acted. A small, controlled explosion of mud and rocks sent the first enemy sprawling. He didn't even have to aim perfectly. The trap did the work for him. Screams and startled shouts echoed through the ridge. Chaos erupted among the enemy ranks. Ethan moved quickly, firing precise shots, his hands steady despite the cold. Every move was deliberate, every action calculated. The coffee stain on his uniform didn't matter. The ridicule of the camp didn't matter. He was proving a truth no one had dared admit. Humans, underestimated and overlooked, could turn the tide with nothing but wit and courage. The enemy tried to regroup, but Ethan's traps, his knowledge of the terrain, and his sudden ferocity kept them off balance. Every attempt to flank or overwhelm him met failure. And through it all, he whispered to himself. They thought it was just a cadet. They thought humans were weak. They were wrong. The night stretched on. Sounds of struggle and confusion carried over the ridge. But Ethan remained focused, calm, relentless. For every step the enemy took forward, he had already anticipated 2 moves ahead. He wasn't just defending a ditch. He was rewriting the rules of engagement. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time blurred in the cold, adrenaline-fueled haze. But by the first hint of dawn, the enemy was in retreat. Those who survived fled, battered and humiliated. They had underestimated the smallest detail. A human who refused to back down, a mind willing to see possibilities where others saw obstacles. Ethan slumped in the mud, exhausted but exhilarated. His coffee-stained shirt was ruined, his hands raw. But he didn't care. He had survived the night. He had won against the odds. And somewhere far across the battlefield, the enemy would carry the memory of this ditch, and the lesson that humans were not to be underestimated. As the sun's first light touched the ridge, Ethan looked over the battlefield. Small victories counted. Tiny triumphs mattered. And a single cadet, left alone to guard a ditch, had proven that courage and cleverness could rewrite history. Dawn had barely broken over the ridge when Ethan Cole heard it. The coordinated march of boots, heavier and more organized than the scouts from last night. These weren't probing parties. This was a real assault. The enemy had regrouped, underestimated his lone stand, and now they were coming for the ditch in force. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the horizon. Shadows stretched across the frostbitten ground, dozens of figures advancing with precision. He allowed himself a brief smile. They thought this would be easy. They thought they'd crush a single cadet before breakfast. They were wrong. Ethan had already anticipated this. Overnight, he prepared the ditch, not just as a defensive line, but as a gauntlet. Small trenches redirected movement. Rocks masked by mud were ready to trip the unwary, and hidden pits would catch anyone who charged blindly. Every inch of ground worked in his favor. The first enemy squad appeared over the ridge, confident, armor glinting in the weak sunlight. Their leader, a tall figure with a commanding stance, shouted orders. Cadet alone. Overrun the ditch. Make it quick. Ethan exhaled slowly, finger poised on the trigger. He let the first wave advance, moving them exactly where he wanted. One misstep, one poorly judged stride, and they'd fall into traps he had set. A soldier stepped on a shallow pit Ethan had disguised with mud and frost. His scream was cut short as he stumbled forward, caught by the edge of the trench. Chaos rippled through the enemy lines. Ethan fired precise shots, each one calculated, each one hitting weak points or creating further confusion. The enemy stumbled, falling into mud, tripping over hidden debris. Their formation crumbled like sandcastles under a rising tide. But this was only the beginning. The enemy leader barked orders, and the second wave pressed forward, trying to flank him. Ethan didn't panic. He knew the terrain better than they did. Every rock, every mound of earth was a weapon in his hands. He moved swiftly, almost silently, from one side of the ditch to the other, leading the enemy into more traps. Small explosions of dirt and debris erupted as strategically placed charges went off, startling soldiers and breaking their rhythm. Just a cadet! One enemy muttered under his breath as he scrambled out of a pit. How is this possible? Ethan didn't answer. He smiled grimly, letting the sound of his rifle and the chaos do the talking. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had no meaning here. Every attempt the enemy made to regroup was thwarted. Every step they took seemed preordained, guided by the cadets' anticipation. Ethan wasn't just surviving. He was dictating the flow of battle. At one point, the enemy tried to charge the ditch head-on. Ethan had prepared for this. A hidden cable snapped a tripwire, sending a net of debris and stakes into the path of the first soldiers. They fell, entangled, screaming, and the others hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Ethan took advantage. He fired, moved, and struck again, each action deliberate. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a human storm, unpredictable, clever, relentless. By mid-morning, the enemy lines were in disarray. Soldiers retreated, stumbled, or fell into traps they didn't even know existed. The commanding officer tried to rally them, but hesitation and fear had set in. Ethan paused for a moment, catching his breath. He looked over the battlefield. Scattered enemy troops, broken formations, confusion everywhere. And all it had taken was one cadet, a ditch, and a refusal to be underestimated. He whispered to himself. They thought it would be easy. They thought humans were weak, but I am here. A sudden shout broke through the chaos. Ethan turned his head just in time to see the enemy leader raising a signal flare, calling for reinforcements. The battle wasn't over yet, but Ethan didn't flinch. He adjusted his position in the ditch, eyes scanning for the next move. He had prepared for this, anticipating the enemy's desperation. Every hidden pit, every trap, every advantage in the terrain was ready. The enemy would learn today that humans weren't to be underestimated. Not just soldiers, not just veterans, but even a coffee-stained cadet left alone to guard a ditch. And when they did, it would be too late. The sun climbed higher over the ridge, but its weak light did little to warm the frozen ground. Ethan Cole crouched in the ditch, muscles aching, lungs burning, but his mind was sharper than ever. The enemy had regrouped or tried to, but now they were predictable. Every move, every hesitation, every misstep was feeding into the trap he had carefully set. He glanced over the chaos below. Soldiers scrambled, tripping over hidden pits, slipping on muddy slopes, and falling into the cleverly disguised channels he had carved in the dirt. Smoke from small explosions and scattered debris rose into the pale morning sky. The enemy thought they were in control, but they were walking through a gauntlet designed by a cadet no one took seriously. Ethan allowed himself a grim smile. They thought this was just a ditch, he muttered under his breath. They thought it was just a cadet. They were wrong. From a ridge, the enemy leader barked orders, trying desperately to regain control. His voice carried, sharp and commanding, but the soldiers were faltering. Fear had begun to creep in. The human in the ditch, this coffee-stained cadet, was unlike anything they expected. Ethan had anticipated their panic. He activated a series of small devices hidden along the trench, sending bursts of blinding smoke into the enemy's formation. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Soldiers yelled at one another, stepping into traps they hadn't even noticed before. The leader's shouts grew frantic, drowned by the chaos. Then Ethan struck again. He rolled a small bundle of rocks and debris down a slope, hitting several enemy soldiers in the back. They stumbled, fell, and blocked the path of those behind them. The formation collapsed. The enemy's numerical advantage was meaningless. Confusion and fear had leveled the battlefield, but Ethan didn't stop there. His mind raced through every scenario he had imagined during training drills and quiet nights of strategy. He repositioned himself, using the trench's curves to create new angles of attack. Every enemy advance was met with precise fire and clever manipulation of the terrain. From their perspective, it looked like the ditch was defended by dozens of soldiers. But it was only one cadet who refused to be underestimated. The enemy leader's frustration boiled over. He shouted for a flanking maneuver, attempting to bypass the trench entirely. Ethan anticipated this. Hidden stakes and tripwires caught the flanking soldiers off guard. They fell hard, yelping in surprise, and chaos erupted on both sides of the ridge. Ethan's confidence surged. He had become the architect of the battlefield. Every misstep by the enemy was a confirmation of what he already knew. Humans, underestimated and overlooked, could turn the tide with cunning audacity and determination. He glanced briefly at the rising sun. Its light glinted off the enemy's armor, but also illuminated their vulnerability. Panic was spreading like wildfire. They had trained for years to face organized forces, disciplined troops, but not one coffee-stained cadet would mine like a razor. A shout rang out. One of the enemy soldiers had finally realized the truth. The human in the ditch wasn't alone, not because of numbers, but because he controlled the battlefield itself. Each trap, each clever positioning, each time attack created the illusion of a force far larger than reality. Ethan pressed the advantage. He fired in short, deliberate bursts, taking out key soldiers and causing further confusion. The enemy's formation fractured completely. Soldiers tripped over each other in their haste to escape. Commanders shouted, but their voices were lost in the chaos they had allowed a single human to create. And then came the moment Ethan had been waiting for. The enemy leader, realizing his soldiers were failing and morale was crumbling, tried one last desperate charge. But the path had been prepared. Rocks, pits, and carefully camouflaged obstacles stopped him in his tracks. His soldiers couldn't follow. The flank collapsed. The human cadet, underestimated and alone, had turned the tide. Ethan stood for a brief second, rifle raised, surveying the battlefield. His coffee-stained shirt, torn and muddy, didn't matter. His uniform was a mess, his body exhausted, but he had proven something far more important. Humans, clever and daring, were never to be underestimated. The enemy stumbled backward, panic in their eyes, realization dawning too late. They had walked into a trap, crafted not by an army, but by one determined human mind. The ridge was quiet for a moment, the wind carrying the distant cries of retreating soldiers. Ethan lowered his rifle and allowed himself a deep breath. He had survived, he had fought, and he had triumphed. The ridge, and the ditch that everyone thought meaningless, had become a symbol of human ingenuity, courage, and resilience. For the first time that morning, Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. The enemy would remember this day. They would tell their leaders about the coffee-stained cadet who had bested an entire squad. And when they did, every commander would understand the same thing Ethan had always known. Humans were far more dangerous than anyone dared to imagine. The sun rose fully over the ridge, pale light spilling across the battlefield. Frost and mud glinted in the morning rays. But the enemy's presence had dwindled to nothing more than scattered, disoriented figures retreating into the valley below. Ethan Cole sat in the shallow ditch, exhausted but alive. His coffee-stained shirt clung to his back, torn and smeared with mud, but it didn't matter. He had survived the night and the morning, faced the enemy alone and won. Against all odds, a single cadet had held the line, and rewritten what the enemy thought they knew about humans. He surveyed the battlefield. Trenches were shattered, tripwires snapped, mud pits revealed. Soldiers of the enemy army were scattered like leaves in a storm. Some ran blindly, some limped away, and a few simply froze in disbelief. One by one, their retreat became a full-scale collapse. Ethan's mind replayed the night. Every trap, every hidden advantage, every calculated risk. It wasn't brute strength that had won this battle. It was strategy, patience, and audacity. One human, underestimated and alone, had outsmarted an entire enemy squad. From the ridge, a flag waved. Ethan squinted and recognized it. The human command signaling the line had held. Reinforcements would arrive soon, but the day had already been won. He didn't need them. The enemy had already learned a lesson that would echo across the battlefield. Never underestimate humans. A distant shout caught his attention. The enemy commander, tall, armored, and furious, was waving for his soldiers to regroup, but was futile. Disarray had taken hold. His troops refused orders, stumbled over the traps, and scattered into the valley. By morning, they had learned the hardest truth. One human could make all the difference. Ethan lowered his rifle and allowed himself a moment of quiet. Victory tasted like cold air and mud, but it was sweet nonetheless. He wasn't a hero yet, not officially, but he had proven something bigger. Humans weren't weak. They weren't predictable. And even the smallest, seemingly insignificant soldier could change the course of a war. The wind carried a faint sound from the camp below. Cheers. Other cadets and soldiers had heard of the victory. Ethan smiled faintly. They wouldn't know the full story yet. The coffee-stained cadet, left to guard a ditch, had held the enemy in chaos until human reinforcements could secure the ridge. Sergeant Lawson arrived, dusting frost and dirt off his uniform. He looked at Ethan, eyes wide, then shook his head in disbelief. "Cadet, I didn't believe you could do it," Lawson said. His voice was rough, but there was awe hidden beneath the gruff tone. "I didn't think anyone could hold that ditch alone, but you did." Ethan shrugged, a small, tired grin on his face. "I just did what had to be done," he replied. "No," Lawson said firmly. "You did more than that. You reminded everyone why humans aren't to be underestimated." Ethan's gaze swept over the ridge one last time. Broken enemy soldiers fled down the valley, disorganized and humiliated. The battlefield was quieting, but the message had been delivered. They thought humans were weak. They were wrong. That line echoed in Ethan's mind, louder than the wind or the distant cries of retreat. And he knew it wasn't just him. This was bigger than a single cadet, a single ditch, a single battle. Humanity itself had made its mark today. By midday, reinforcements arrived, securing the ridge and tending to the few human casualties. Ethan remained on the trench line, proud but silent. He didn't need praise. The victory itself was enough. And somewhere far beyond the ridge, the enemy would tell stories of the coffee-stained cadet, the one human who had turned the tide. They would tell their leaders, their soldiers, and anyone who would listen, never underestimate humans. Ethan watched the enemy disappear into the horizon. The ridge was quiet now, but history had been made. A single cadet underestimated, alone and covered in coffee stains, had proven a truth that would be remembered long after the battle ended. Humanity's cunning, resilience, and audacity were unstoppable. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of victory. Ethan Cole stood, stretching his aching muscles, and looked down at the trench he had defended. A simple ditch, a single soldier, a human mind willing to fight against impossible odds. That was all it took to win a war.